So, hi, everybody. This is Dr. Eileen from the African Youth Diaspora Organization in the state of African Diaspora, as well as the AfCFTA Youth Advisory Council. I know there's a mouthful of titles, but that's pretty much give you a big picture of what I do in Africa. I am an ecosystem builder. I like to think of myself actually as a community advocate and really into youth empowerment and community economic development in the gist of it. But I also kind of think of myself as like a system builders. What does that mean? We can talk about that a little bit more later, like in my later questions.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Now, you are an American of Chinese heritage. Okay.
Yes.
Now, yet you are very involved in issues concerning and in organizations dealing with African issues. Now, the first time I met you on LinkedIn talking about Africa, I was curious. Okay. And since we agreed to have this discussion and seeing your bio, I was even more curious. So tell me, what attracted you to get involved in African issues?
Frankly speaking, I didn't really come into this space until 3 to 4 years ago.
Okay.
I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, I should say. And I was very ignorant about what has been happening in Africa. And I was pretty much, like most of the world, the way that we understand Africa is through media. And unfortunately, the media has not been kind to Africa, to the continent and the people. So very simply put, I just want to see justice served,
Okay.
For Africa, Africans and African diaspora. Personally, I feel that we are our brothers and sisters keeper.
Okay.
So I expect you to do the same for me if you see I suffer from injustice. Otherwise, it has been a natural resonance. It feels like my whole life experience has been for this purpose. Being here, being with the people I'm with. But it couldn't have happened earlier. If it happened any earlier, it wouldn't be the right place, the right time, or the right people. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's divine intervention. Not sure if that kind of helped, but if you really want to know why, it's really about seeing justice served. And of course, when you see justice served, it just put everything back to its natural balance and natural order. I think that's important. Yeah.
Okay. Now, when you say seeing justice served, what does that mean? Justice about what in particular, and
Yeah. Okay. So very few people understand the history, or I should say, very few people outside of Africa.
Okay.
Understand the history of the modern African history, and that is including the African diaspora. Very few African diaspora actually know. Of course, it's getting better now, but the African diaspora do not really know African history, and Africans do not really know the struggles that African diaspora went through. So, and then compounded with that, you have foreign actors, imposing their own agenda onto Africa and Africans. And so you make things very complex, and you make things very biased and skewed. For example, the way we see Africa in the US is, recently it's getting better, but before this, it was really about poverty, Boko Haram, violence, pirates, from Somalia, and, Boko Haram from Nigeria, and just very unsafe. And of course, children with big belly, round eyes or flies in the eyes and really starving, things like that. And so that's all we know, like
Okay.
outside of Africa. And but once I knew about Africa, then that was when I realized I was blown away by how skewed the media has been portraying Africa. It was so unfair. It's just so. And then when I first came in, I came into the space as the director of Model United Nations in Johannesburg. I was the director of outreach, and I was responsible for recruiting many African youth ambassadors for the event. And through that process, I get to know Africa really well. For example, my Zimbabwean ambassadors would tell me that their full-time in Zimbabwe would be working 46 hours a week and making $50 a month. And then somebody tell me that, oh, well, actually in the rural area, you make $35. And that's, 4 years ago. And then another friend from Uganda told me that, so they are making $100 a month. And then the highest I heard is in Tanzania, which is making $200 a month as a teacher. Now, in the US, teachers is considered low paying job. We don't, unfortunately, unlike Asia, the US doesn't really respect, the teaching profession as much.
Mm-hmm.
And so that we're getting paid starting salary, $2,500 and things like that. So, but it's still a ratio of 50 times. So then now, regardless what happened, because there's always the excuses why a country is making less than and more developed country, so on and so forth. But it's not even relevant anymore, because when how do you even justify a country making $50 a month? I mean, it's totally not just, it doesn't even make sense. It does not make logical sense. So then when I get to know the ambassadors really well, and I dug deeper, it was just astounding, the history the suffering, the injustice, the unfairness, and the fact that Zimbabwe is still in sanction. And then when he first was put in sanction was because of Mugabe's policy, and he's long gone. I don't understand why. I know some of the people who knows the insider information really well, and they will say, well, because they have human rights violation issues and corruption and blah blah. And I was like, why don't you try to live on $50 a month and see if you will be corrupted? There's just a lot of injustice that does not take somebody who understands history to understand something is really wrong. So that was kind of where the beginning of my journey. And then, of course, myself, I grew up as a colonial subject. I grew up in the British colony, and I remember growing up putting whites on the pedestal, and it really affected me for a long time. So when I ran into one of the Nigerian youth ambassador, he told me one time, he's like, Dr. Eileen, when I see you, I want to touch you. And I was like, why would you want to touch me? And he's like, because you're white, and so your skin is cooler and softer. And I was like, that's really, I know. And I was like, okay, that's messed up. And it reminded me of myself when I was younger, because I remember going to restaurants, and then there'll be a bunch of people standing in line and come to white people, and they will come to the, and then they will get seated first. It doesn't matter how long everybody else has waited. If you're white, you get seated first. White, I'm talking about Caucasian, right? And I still remember that. I remember not saying that, being punished for speaking, the native language, right? And I remember being taught Western history and not knowing how, because it was like I was born in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was a British colony. So particularly speaking, I've never lived in China, because I left Hong Kong before it got returned to China. But in any case, when I was in Hong Kong, everything was celebrated. Princess Diana and Prince Charles' wedding, and Queen Elizabeth's birthday, every night we saw, the crowning procession at night, it was just, I just still remember all of this. And then you go to the post office, you saw Queen Elizabeth her picture. And I was like, we just got this idea that everything white is better. And that was intentional. It's also that with 6 million people, we only got 2 universities. So we were actually trained as manager to manage our own people, but the rest are labor. We're just labor force. We generate revenue for the British Empire. But then also, of course, the bubble burst. Later, I found out that Hong Kong was ceded to the England because China lost the Opium War when China didn't want to accept opium as a form of payment instead of silver. So the British Empire, under the rule of Queen Victoria, just instigated a war and then took over Hong Kong. And then subsequently, what they did was kind of like what Berlin Conference did to Africa. A bunch of them came in and say, I want this, I want that, open the port so we can do business. They always come in as a business. They didn't come in as the British Empire. They came in as East Indian, company or something like that. That's the same for Nigeria. That's the same for India. They come in as a company. They didn't come in as and the company has its own army. Their army at one point is bigger than the British Empire. So it's ridiculous. But anyway, so we all are very, gullible. So the intention was very